Good evening, gentlemen. We'll begin tonight with a recap of what we discussed last time. We were looking into the idea of false prophets, telltale signs of false prophets. By the way, even though there is no institution of prophecy current, that is, we don't have any certifiable prophets, uh, it is part of our belief system, as Maimonides makes explicit, that God does put his word in the mouths of men, and it is something that has existed and will exist. And perhaps there are those among us today who are qualified to be prophets, uh, even though they might not be prophets for whatever reason. Perhaps it's because God just chooses not to give his message. Sometimes that could be the case. Doesn't mean there aren't people qualified. We hope that one day we will have prophets again. There's been times when prophets were kind of rare. Sometimes you could have centuries between the revelation of prophets, and sometimes they were much more numerous. So we're just in a little bit of a funk. But God willing, we will see the return of prophecy to the Jewish people today. But that doesn't mean that the role of the prophet goes unfilled. That is, certain sages or people who are supposed to be, at least the representation of Torah wisdom, uh, can also fill that role. They can be the ones who give us musar, perhaps not as well as the prophets, but they're still good stand-ins. The Rambam says you look for the people like prophets or those who are similar to them. He was referring to Chazal, let's say, the sages of the Mishnah, among whom the sages realized there were certainly those capable of Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration. There were those who might have been just perhaps the generation was not worthy of them. And conversely, because you have people who fill the role of the prophets, you also have the people around who are basically the false prophets. And just like in the olden days, there were many false prophets, perhaps they even outnumbered the true prophets, and they were up to no good at the time, but there were telltale signs of who they are. Uh, so too today, uh, those who should take the role of prophets also have the false types, the charlatans, to deal with, or to at least show the people the way, enlighten us how not to be tricked by them. So the telltale signs of so-called false prophets, yes men. We saw that was basically what Yeravam and Achav had. They had people, men who appeared to be prophets, who were basically there to tell them what they wanted to hear and spread their message to the people, keep the regime in power. And yeah, that's not what prophets are supposed to do. And we saw another factor of one mouth. That's how Jehoshaphat, was able to identify Ahab's false prophets, even though they were prophets of God, so to speak. They weren't, let's say, preaching in the Baal. He could tell because they were so much similar to one another that it must have been that they were just faking it. And this leads to the other factor that we saw in those two stories from the Book of Kings, that they seem to be patrons of the regime, and they have an involvement with politics. So that's another thing. The prophets work for the kings almost, and they seem to echo a lot of things that the kings want to say. It's almost their tools there, tools of the regime. And nowadays, this can be, for example, those people who only get their information and dutifully follow whatever the official government mouthpieces are saying, whether it's government registered government mouthpieces, like the governmental spokesman, or those who are ostensibly supposed to have been, let's say, a media, the various, that's the plural of medium, the journalists, etc., who are supposed to have been a watchdog on the powers that be. Instead, they become their tools and they just spread the message. And sometimes the message is not necessarily one that is actually good for the people. Unfortunately, a lot of people who gain power and become politicians usually have their own interests at heart, and less those of the people whom they're supposed to represent or who they're supposed to lead. Just a side note over here, we saw that Jezebel, the prophets reserved a special ire for her. Why? All the kings before her, the previous eras, were criticized and punished. Ahab is basically given almost a verbatim prophecy of doom that his predecessors were given. Just like Yerovam and his son were told that they were going to be wiped out because of their failure to lead the Jewish people properly, the 10 tribes. And the same thing happened to Baasha and his son. When it came Ahab's turn to get the message, Eliyahu Navi also added, by the way, God also has something in store for your wife. Jezebel is the one who massacred the true prophets and supported prophets of the Baal, whereas we saw last time, Ahab actually allowed certain prophets of the Lord, lowercase this because they weren't true prophets. He basically had his patron prophets, and they were the ones who were encouraging him. They were good enough, so they were not subject to persecution because they towed the party line. Now let's get into other passages in the Bible that discuss this issue, so we can find other factors. This is the first time in the book of Devarim, in Deuteronomy, the 13th chapter. And whenever we get to this, I like to point out that it so happens that this is a little bit off. The way they number these chapters is not the common way of doing it. See, this is from Machon Mamre. So what does it have? There's a break over here. There's a parsha break. So really the parsha should start over here. If I had been dividing the book into chapters, I would have put chapter 13 start here, and this would have been 13:1. But we see that chapter 13 actually grabs the last verse of the previous parsha, which talks about the prohibition of adding to or detracting from the Torah. Everything I've commanded you today, this is Moses telling the people, lo tosef alav v'lo tigra mimenu. Do not add to it and do not subtract. And then we have the parsha of the false prophet. Ki yakum b'kirbecha naviyo cholem chalom. You have shall arise among you a prophet or some dreamer of dreams. And this is kind of interesting because this basically describes the man who would be the center of the Christian religion, the classic false prophet who basically tells the people, okay, give up on the Torah. Now let's go do something else, a different form of worship. Let's say worship a demigod as opposed to just God. So he is described in this verse, and it was his Talmidim, it was his followers who took this verse and joined it to this chapter thematically. This is the first chapter. They took it from the previous parsha. They connected to this one. Why? Because it was this false prophet's, successors who were the most diligent at subtracting and adding commandments of the Torah. That is, they basically threw out most of the commandments. They added a few simple ones, the communion, etc., and belief in the fact that one could be redeemed by mere belief in this man, and that was good enough. So very ironic that they did such a thing. What does this fellow do? Faith. He gives people a sign, and then it comes true. He predicts something. Rambam, as I think we're not going to get into these halachot. It'd be fitting to study the last 3 chapters of the Yesodei Torah, as a conclusion to what we're just doing now. But I believe that Rabbi Bar-Hayim will be getting up to there soon anyways in his new series. He does quite a few halachot every day in this section, so he's probably going to get to it. So we're not going to record something independent for this. I just recommend when that comes out, you check it out there. So he says that this prophet then uses the fact that this wondrous sign, that means he predicted something that he basically could not have predicted it comes true, in order to show that he really has supernatural knowledge of the future. And then he says, so let's go worship other gods, gods with which we are not familiar. And Moses tells them, Lo tishmal divrei hanavi, don't listen to the words of that prophet. O el cholei machalomu, or that dreamer of dreams. Why? The Lord your God is actually testing you. He allowed this false prophet to succeed in at least creating what looks like some sort of miraculous sign in order to test you. You should know that any time...
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. Could you please repeat?
Silly phone. Any time you have someone preach that we should go worship something other than God, so that's a telltale sign he's a false prophet, even if he can do wonders. And God allows false prophets to do such a thing, or at least succeed in doing such a thing. Perhaps it's just a sleight of hand, and we don't understand how he was able to do it, but it's a test. And then another classic verse which is I only like to talk about it because it brings out the dictic aspect, the grammatical aspect, and that is a lot of verbs sometimes are switched. They have the accent on the last syllable, but for emphasis, when coming to a pause, normally at an etnach or at a siluk, but sometimes even in other types of trops, if it's a pausal form, then the accent is shifted to earlier in the verse. So it says here a few sentences: "Acharei Adonai Elechem telechu, lo'thothi ra'u, with mislothau tishmoru, uvkolo tishma'u, lo'thotha avodu, vothith bakun." This verb over here should be telechu, but it becomes telechu for emphasis, even though there's just a tipacha over here. It's the end of the sentence. Walk with the Lord thy God. Lo'thoth yira'u, and fear him. It should tira'u. Etnach, there's a etnachta over here, so it makes sense that this would shift to it would shift the accent to the resh, even though it normally on the aleph. And by the way, all these middle syllables are false syllables in the original thing. It's teilechu with a shavana in the original form, but for emphasis, the shavana graduates to an actual full syllable. Same thing over here. It should be tira'u, and now it becomes tiro. And without tishmoru. Normally it should be tishmaru with a shavana under the mem. And same thing over here. It should be tishma'u with a shavana, but here it's tishma'u. And same thing over here. Ta'avodu should be ta'avdu. There's not even a shvana there. It's a shvanach. But the vet, because of emphasis, gets this. And that's that verse. And then, as is fitting thematically, the next few parashiot talk about someone who tries to instigate others. He tries to trick others or convince others to worship other gods. He doesn't necessarily present himself as a prophet, but more like a friend. It says here, someone close to you, your chicha ben imecha, your maternal brother, son, daughter, the wife of thy bosom, a friend who's really close to you, tries to say, let's go worship idols, similar to this false prophet over here. And then we have the case of a group of sinister individuals who are actually able to corrupt an entire city. The Erni Dachat, they found out that the judges found out that the majority of people in the city are guilty of worshiping idols. They've basically been persuaded to do so by these sinister characters. And you could see that there's one theme that unites all these parashiot, and that is these people are preachers of idolatry and other heresies. So the false prophet is just one type of preacher. In this case, it's a close relative, and in this case, it's Anashim B'nei V'lial, whoever they might be. So that's a telltale sign. That's the number 4. They preach idolatry and other heresies. If you, let's say, have a rabbinic movement, that has, okay, you could have strange halachic positions or just unpopular ones or ones that are just controversial. That doesn't make anybody anything bad. For example, I don't really take a stance in, let's say, feminism and ideas about women trying to do more mitzvahs and things like that. I think it's really not nice to tell people that they have bad intentions a lot of times when we're not mind readers. And also, I think that there is room for women to do more things within Judaism. So I don't really care about that. There's some people who think, no, anything feminism or anything like that is pasul minei uve. I don't care about that. But I understand why many would be bothered, like myself, when you have groups, maybe there's some overlap, it doesn't really matter. You have someone who wants to, for example, just advocate for the permissibility of sins. The Torah says something is forbidden, strictly forbidden, usually related to the big 3, idolatry, immorality, or bloodshed. And that's very popular things nowadays. And they just want to give blanket permissions for people to do such a thing. That's kind of bad. You could tell there's one well-known false prophet who I have in mind. He's a very prominent individual. The Gentile world knows him very well. He's in all sorts of lists. He's prominent, young, shouldn't be young anymore. He must be in his 40s. Rabbi, so-called. And all he does is preach Averos. So watch out for that. Next, you have here a few chapters later in Dvarim, the 18th parak. It talks about a different type of false prophet. God tells us that we shouldn't do like the Gentiles among whom we would live. Talking about the ancient Canaanites, they do all sorts of things. Moses says, "Lo yimatzevecha ma'avir benovi toba eish," should be not found among thee anyone who passes his son or daughter in the fire, usually associated with the Molech worship. Unfortunately, a lot of forms of idolatry also involved with some sort of trying to discern the future, divination, and so forth. Kosem samim, some sort of magician. The exact one is also subject to dispute. Me'onen u'menachesh u'mechashef. The Talmud says various examples of this. Me'onen is a person who looks at different times and tries to extrapolate from them what should be done. Menachesh, an enchanter. Mechashef, a sorcerer. Chover is a type of person who has familiar spirits. Shoel ov yudoni, different types of necromancy. Vidoreshel amithim, also seeking out the dead. These are things that are forbidden, things that they used to do in the old days. Let's take the Maimonidean approach. This didn't work, but there are people who tried. And sometimes there are people who claim to have the ability to do this, but it didn't work, but they were just there to take people, to try to separate people from their money. And then Moshe Rabbeinu says, no, you don't need these types of people, these fortune tellers. Nafi, God had promised the people, Navi b'kir b'cha me'achecha kamoni, yakim l'cha Hashem alkecha. Moses promises, God has already told me that God will raise up a prophet from among thy brethren, like me, and to him shall you listen. You have to listen, it's a commandment to listen to the true Navi. And he says that this is based on what happened at Sinai, where God promised Moses, because the people asked for it, they would get prophets. Navi akim lahem b'kerev achihem kamocha. Almost forbidden. Moshe Rabbeinu says that God told him that I will raise up a prophet from among them, among their brethren, like you, like Moshe, just like Moshe Rabbeinu was a prophet, so too will the future prophet. I'll put my word in his mouth, and he will speak to them everything I command him. And it should be also that a person is punished for not listening to the Navi. Here we have a positive commandment previously. Over here, listen to the Navi. It was actually a little bit higher over here. A person has to listen to the Elav Tishmaun, listen to him, right there. It says it right there. And now it says, what's the punishment for not listening to a Navi? But what could happen? There's a number of ways one could disobey the prophet. Let's count this. Ha'ish asher lo yishma'al divarai, asher daber b'shmi. Anochi adrosh mim. A person won't listen to the prophet. Okay, God will take care of it. Acha navi asher yazid l'daber davar b'shmi. If you have a Navi who dares to say something in my name, but it's not something that I commanded him to say. There's someone, a Navi, he has a reputation as one, but he's just saying false in God's name, even though he was not commanded to say it. That's one example. Or someone who just speaks in the name of other gods, like we saw Ahab's people. So there's two things a Navi could do wrong. He could say things in God's name, but that's not what God said. Or he could just be speaking for the Baal. And basically, this is Ahab's types of prophets over here in the first line, and his wife's types of prophets, the ones of Baal, the second one, Umethan of Yehu. So that prophet should be put to death. He shall die. And then Moshe Rabbeinu continues over here. What if you're wondering, so how do I know who's a prophet or not? And he says, well, the type of person who can predict the future, that's a true prophet. If you have someone who cannot predict the future, he says something's going to happen, and it doesn't happen, so you know he's not a prophet. But what if you get over here? Previously, Moshe Rabbeinu told us, sometimes you have a prophet who will succeed in bringing about a miraculous sign, but we're still not supposed to listen to him. The answer is, if he can't predict the future, yes, don't listen to him. If he's able to predict the future, what we call a sign, so you can listen to him as long as he doesn't tell you, for example, to do something that's plainly wrong. For example, like worshiping idols. There's never going to be such a case. Let's go worship idols. It's now mutar. That's how you know he's up to no good. There's going to be this principle also. We're going to see hora'at sha'ah. It's going to be dealt with by Rambam. Sometimes a prophet could suspend a severe prohibition, any prohibition, even the severe ones, if God told him to. But you will not find that a prophet will, let's say, suspend the prohibition against idolatry. That's something that a prophet cannot do. You know he's a prophet. So this chapter over here, as opposed to this one, basically gives out a different point. This one over here that I've highlighted talks about the preaching aspect. The prophet is basically a preacher, and he could even be replaced by a preacher. Here we have the Mesit, and here we have the Madichim, the people who lead people astray. They don't have to be prophets. So too, the type of person who tries to convince others to worship idols uh, doesn't have to be a prophet or even have the trappings of a prophet. Whereas here it's talking about the supernatural aspect of it. The prophet as the fortune teller. The Gentiles who lived in Canaan and in Mitzrayim, in ancient Canaan and Egypt, they sought out people who could tell them the future. Like I said, fortune tellers over here. Jews have some equivalents to that, the supernatural. It's called a prophet. It's not a petty fortune teller, of course, but the Jewish prophet is supposed to be able to predict the future accurately, and that's one of the signs of what he does. So what's a sign of false prophets? They're just petty fortune tellers. They do it even for money, and indeed that's the way most psychics and people like that seem to be wanting a lot of money from a lot of people. Yet, if they did have the powers they claim to have, perhaps they should have just used that to, I don't know, play the lottery or the stock market if they want to be slightly more legitimate and get themselves rich then, instead of trying to play on the fears and superstitious feelings and the gullibility of others. And so that's one sign. The sixth sign is they're liars in God's name. That's the one over here, those types of false prophets. And anyone who speaks in the name of other gods, another sign. So we have 7 signs of false prophet. Whereas a true prophet's words always come true when he is anti-establishment. He's there to keep the powers that be in check. He's supposed to have perhaps not necessarily animosity, but there should be a tension between him and the prophet. This tension was actually established with the initiation of the kingdom, the Malchus, within the people of Israel. It used to be that the prophet was the leader. Like the Rambam says, you could have a melech, a navir, or a shofet. So melech, we get to later in history. Let's start with Moses. Basically, men like Moses, Joshua, Gideon, and Samuel were both the leader. They were the shofet basically, and they were prophets. So that's the best kind. So you know that whatever they're doing is right, and they claimed among themselves. They never took taxes. They never wronged anybody. Moshe Rabbeinu and Yeshua and Shmuel had very good track records of being men of the people, yet certainly fit leaders and beyond the usual behavior of mere mortals. And then you have, let's say, Shofetim, take Othniel ben Kenaz, Ehud ben Gera, and other such men who did not lord themselves over the people. They were not necessarily prophets, but they were still good at what they did. And there's very little criticism that we find in the words of the sages, if any, and certainly the words of the prophets themselves who committed these books to writing. They are the ideal Jewish leaders. Whereas once we have a kingdom, we have actual kings who are hereditary and have a lot more power, and the power to tax especially, and to bring the people out to war. Suddenly the prophets have to be a check on the kings because the powers have been separated. So you see this with Samuel, who rebuked Saul a number of times, basically. Everything he did after he anointed him, especially in all the wars to which Saul took the people, Samuel always steps in and says, with criticism, first, you might not be fit to have a lasting kingdom. Eventually, no, you might not be king even today. And eventually it's you're not even fit to continue being king. Okay, we saw that in last time we looked at the book of Shmuel. And this started also with David. David was rebuked severely by one of his patron prophets. And that was, I guess that should have been a good precedent for how David accepted the rebuke and the ensuing punishment that God had decreed. But after that, we find that the kings had a really hard time. Yes, there are kings of Yehuda who did accept what the prophets did, but eventually they started becoming hostile to these prophets who were there to keep them in check. So much so that once we get to the end of the First Temple era, we find false prophets cropping up all over the place. This is in the book of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu. But not only that, we find that Yirmiyahu himself is basically the most persecuted prophet we find in the scriptures. Yes, in Ahab's time, they were massacring the prophets. So Eliyahu Navi, that would be Elijah, claims to God, they're trying to kill me. I'm the only one left. take my soul. I'm not worth it anymore. But uh, it, technically speaking, it wasn't so bad. The prophets were saved, and eventually the people accepted a revolution led by those who were certainly more sympathetic to the institution of prophecy and those who the prophets themselves uh, approved of. And we could find that that's talking about the coup and the revolution, and eventually overthrow of the Omride dynasty by Yehu and his subsequent dynasty. But skip ahead a few hundred years, and we find even the land of Yehuda now that Yirmiyahu is just barely surviving. He mentions a few times in his book they were trying to kill him, and he survived. God kept him alive, and he lived to see all his terrible predictions come true. So let's look at this on the inside. This he's saying at the beginning of when Yehoiakim ben Yoshio became king. Yoshio was the last true righteous king. He died tragically in battle, and his first son didn't stay on the throne for long. He was deposed by the Pharaoh. So the second son, Yehoiakim, takes the throne. He's apparently also the oldest son. The people basically skipped over him because they knew that his younger brother was better, except Pharaoh didn't want him to stay on the throne. That would be Yehoahaz. And basically, Yehoiakim is going to be leading the people down the wrong path. It's just going to go throw more gasoline on the fire that's leading to destruction. And he was told to go to the temple and predict the destruction of the temple. Go among all the pilgrims there and say about how this is going to be. The punchline is, I will make this temple like Shiloh, which was the first Jewish temple to be destroyed. That's pretty bad. And it says here, and by the way, as always, Targum Yonathan throws in, the Torah, the Nevi'im don't tell us when this word Nevi'im is referring to false prophets. It's Jonathan's translation into Aramaic that normally tells us this. So it says the Kohanim who were there and the false prophets and all the people, the rabble heard what Yirmiyahu had to say in God's own house, in the temple, and they arrested him. His wife Pethuoso, Wayith Pesuotho HaKohanim Nevi'im L'chola Amle Mor Moth Tamuth. They grabbed him and said, "Oh man, you're going to have to die for this." Madua ni beitha v'shem Adonai lemor kishilo yikeh habayit hazeh v'yarazoth teharav me'en yoshev v'yikahel kol ha'amel Yirmiyahu b'veit Adonai. So they ganged up on him, and they said he deserves to die. It says they grabbed him also. Why? Because he prophesied the destruction of the temple. What's so bad about that? He could say, predict that it's going to be destroyed. They could just laugh at him, think he's a madman. That was a type of heresy. In the olden days, Yirmiyahu criticizes people for this. By the way, we have a previous shurim about this. The people were convinced at the time that no matter what God could do to punish them, he can never destroy the temple. Why? Because the way they perceived it was that the temple is God's house, so to speak. Very primitive way of thinking. And unlike, let's say, Shiloh, or anything else for that matter, this temple was indestructible, could not fall into the hands of foreign oppressors and foreign conquerors, and certainly could not be destroyed. And on the contrary, because it is there, it is invincible, and it protects the city of Jerusalem and the people inside. God would not allow his own house, so to speak. Problem was they weren't saying it, so to speak. They're actually believing it. He would not allow any harm to come to his own house. So the fact that a prophet comes up and says, there is a churban, an impending churban, destruction of this temple in this city, to them that was heresy. And of course, I don't think it was a righteous indignation, and more like the fact that he really, really bothered them, because he's basically rebuking them and telling them they have to change their behavior in ways they do not like. And they basically put him on trial. And there were people who stood up here. Sorry about that. Okay. Oh, we're getting questions. Okay. The Sarim, these are people who are closer to the king, people who are related to the king often, people who had jobs within the government, and other people told these Kohanim and Nevi'im. Remember, the Kohanim are his adversaries, and the false prophets are also the ones who are accusing him. They basically said, this man is not deserving of death because there's been a previous prophet, Micha HaMorashti, by the way, has his own book. It's one of the 12 prophets who lived in the times of Chizkiyahu, almost a century before this. And he's the one who told the people that, yes, and this is a prophecy in his book, that Jerusalem will end up being a plowed field, and this temple will be Bamot Yar. It's going to be destroyed. It's going to be a high place of the forest, basically in nothing. So he they let him out. He survived this, but that's not the that's not the end of the story. It says here, did Hezekiah, the king of Judah, put this man to death? B'chol Judah, and along with the rest of the Jews, they put him to death. Halo Yareath Adonai. He feared God. He wouldn't do such thing. Perhaps the prophecy should have come true. Micah's prophecy of destruction of Jerusalem could have come true in Hezekiah's days. There was a Neo-Assyrian Empire, and they had done a good job at conquering the 10 tribes and bringing them into exile, and they were besieging Jerusalem, yet it didn't happen. Why? Because he sought God. He entreated God, and God relented. And perhaps it's even worse now. We're in a much worse state than the people were in Hezekiah's time, and perhaps we're bringing this upon ourselves. So Jeremiah apparently was let go at this point, although they would seek to do this again. This is only at the beginning of Joachim's reign. Joachim's reign and the subsequent reign of his younger brother, Tzidkiyahu, are not going to be that good for Yirmiyahu. He's going to be thrown in jail a few times, nearly die, sink into the mire. And it says here that there was another prophet, V'gam ish haya mitnabeh b'shem Adonai Uriyahu ben Shemayahu mikiryat hayarim. This prophet, Uriyahu, son of Shemayahu from Kiryat Yerim, Vayinaveil ir hazot while Aretz hazot kechol divrei Yirmiyahu. He basically was saying, just like Yirmiyahu was saying, about the impending destruction of Jerusalem. And what happened? The King Jehoiakim and all his heroes and all his ministers heard what this Uriyahu, the prophet, was saying, so they sought to kill him. They tried to kill him. Vayishmar Yirmiyahu vayera vayivrach vayavo Misraim. So he escaped to Egypt, this prophet, because he realized they were trying to kill him. That should have been the end of it, but it says Vayishlach Melech Yehoiakim Anashim Mitzrayim. So Yakim sent men to Egypt, sinister men. Elnathan ben Achbor Anashim Ito El Misrayim. Elnathan ben Achbor also comes up elsewhere in the book. He's not such a good guy. And they went to Egypt. They took him out of Egypt. They caught him. They brought him back to Israel. They smote him with the sword. They basically murdered this prophet. It wasn't good enough that he ran away to Egypt. No, they had to bring him back so they could kill him. They cast his carcass among the graves of the people. And that was pretty scary. They tried to do this to Yirmiyahu also. But, Achikam ben Shaphan, Haithel Yirmiyahu, this Achikam ben Shaphan, from a prominent family, there's a few individuals, son of Shaphan, mentioned in this book. He was with Yirmiyahu. He did not let them deliver Yirmiyahu into their hands so they could kill him. So you see that this was a real problem, just preaching the truth. It's probably better to be a false prophet. And around the same time, we have another prophecy recorded in the subsequent chapter. And Yirmiyahu was supposed to act out and create a sign to the various neighboring people and to Joachim itself about the impending Babylonian conquest. Get ready, give yourself over to the Babylonians. And he says that everybody has to give in, because if they don't, they're going to suffer greatly for it. If you don't listen, you're going to get it. It's better to just surrender to Nebuchadnezzar, because God wants him to conquer everything. And then Yirmiyahu tells them, don't listen to your prophets and your various types of sorcerers, the same kind mentioned in the book of Devarim. The false prophets are basically saying, don't serve, don't surrender to this king of Bavel. Yirmiyahu says, Ki sheker heim nebi'im lachem. They are prophesying falsely to you. v'dachti va'avatem. The whole point of what they're trying to do is trying to bring about the exile. You keep listening to these false prophets, just going to make it worse. He continues over here. Well, al tishmol divrei nevi'im omrim lechem lemor lo tavdun melech bavel ki sheker him nebiim lechem. Okay, we saw that. It's almost similar to this verse over here. He lo shalachtim nu mashem. I have not sent them, saith the Lord. V'hem nebi'im b'shmi la shaker. They're prophesying my name falsely. Once again, lemana dichu etchem v'avatem atem anavim nebi'im lechem. They're trying to bring you down with them. They're going down, and you're going down. That's all it's going to do. And he continues over here. Watch out for these Kohanim. Al tishmuel divrei nevichem adivim lechem lemor hinei klevet Hashem mushavim bibavela ata mehira. One of the sticking points that they have was that prior to this, the king of Bavel already took some Jews and prominent vessels of the temple into exile, and these false prophets and priests among them were saying, "Don't worry, we're going to get them back. They shall be returned soon," and that's going to be a sign that also the people coming back, things are going to be good. Al tishmu aleim, don't listen to them. If do it melech Bavel with you have to serve the king of Bavel. It means surrender to him, and then you'll live. Lama tia yirazot chorba. Why should the city be destroyed? The easiest way the prophecy can come true is that the Nebuchadnezzar will conquer the city, take some people into exile, and I guess profane the temple a little bit, not have to destroy it, not have to destroy the whole city. Remember, whenever prophecy is given, it could have its worst possible outcome or its best possible outcome. So even the prophecies, even though they have to come true, it doesn't have to come true in the worst way. If they really are prophets, God's word is with them. They should entreat God. Okay. Why don't they, if they have so much power, they are true prophets, why don't they try to intervene perhaps? Moses, the best example. Elijah, also a good example. Elisha, another example. The prophet could intervene. He could pray and try to prevent tragedy from happening. But because they're false prophets, they can't do that. They're not really communing with God, and their prayers cannot help. So we found some examples also with Samuel, who prayed on behalf of the people. As a matter of fact, it's going to be that the rest of the temple Kalim are going to be taken into Bavel also. He says here, Bavel yuva'u b'shama yu ad yom pokti otham nu mashem v'alitim b'ashivatim al komazeh. They all have to be brought to Bavel. Not only the Kalim that have been taken to exile not coming back, everything is going to be brought to Babylon. They'll be returned eventually when the temple is ready to be rebuilt. But until then, they have to be brought into exile. So you see here one of the other things. Really, true prophets should have intervened and tried to make things better. Instead, these false prophets just make things worse. Also, we mentioned this point before. It's Targum Yonathan who tells us when we have false prophets. The last section over here is from the ensuing chapter, also from Yirmiyahu, but he talks about what happened in Tzidkiyahu's time. Tzidkiyahu was 2 kings later. Yoyakim's son Yehoiachin, or Yechunyah, was king for just a few months and also taken into exile, with the first major exile. Basically all the people who had any merit were removed from Jerusalem, leaving the lowest classes left in Jerusalem. So it says in his 4th year and his 5th month, which would be the month of Av, Hananiah ben Azur Navi, once again, false prophet, who's from Givon, went to God's house, that's the temple, and said this, that God has broken the yoke of the king of Babylon. Things have gotten worse. The temple will survive. People are coming back from exile. He says, remember, this is the this is the prophecy that Yirmiyahu said is the sign of a false prophet. The false prophets are saying that the Kalim will be brought back, and that's telltale sign. No, this guy was saying it also. As the Hananiah ben Azur was saying it to the people, and also Yechonya would be brought back home. The previous king, Yoyakim's son, who's been brought to exile, will be returned. Well, it sounds pretty good. But Yirmiyahu says, Yirmiyahu, the true prophet, said to Hananiah, the false prophet, in front of the Kohanim and all the people, what did he say? Amen ken ya'aseh Hashem, yakem Hashem et dvarecha asher nibeita l'ashiv et kleveth Hashem v'harcho aglah mivel ha'makom hazeh. Yeah, if only be true. That should I wish that what you're saying were to happen. It'd be great if everybody came from Gullus, came back, and also the Caleb. But the problem is, you should just know that's not true. I've been here doing this for a long time, and other Nevi'im. And uh, telltale sign of the future is that, and here the Yirmiyahu makes this very clear. He says a prophet can predict bad, and then it can't come true. That was what Yonah the prophet was worried about. You predict bad, but then the people repent, and God relents, so to speak. He removes the evil gzera. So a prophet who predicts bad and it doesn't come true doesn't mean he's a false prophet. It means that the people actually listen. He's doing his job. Whereas if a prophet predicts good, the good work should come upon the people, and that doesn't come true, that means he is a false prophet. So because Hananiah ben Azur, the false prophet, is saying this, because he's saying that good things are about to happen, he gave himself 2 years for this to happen, it has to now come true. And we're going to see what happens. Vayomer Hananiah le'neichol la'am le'mor ko amar Hashem kacha eshborth ol Nebuchadnezzar melech v'vel v'od shnatayim mim me'al tzavar kol hagoyim v'elchim yah navi l'darko. He continued. He didn't take the warning. Yirmiyahu left on his way. And God basically told him, oh yeah, you should just watch out. This Hananiah ben Azur is going to get his comeuppance. Vayomer Yirmiyahu navi el Hananiah navi shmana Hananiah. Yirmiyahu told this Hananiah, says, listen to me, Hananiah. Now he doesn't call him with any respect. Lo shelachacha Hashem, God has not sent you. You've basically gotten these people confident in falsehood. God is going to cast him off the face of the earth. Hashana atameit. You've given yourself 2 years. This year you are going to die. Ki sarah dibarta el Hashem. You've spoken badly about God, or you've spoken against God. And what happened? He died that very year in the 7th month. We said that this started happening in the 5th month. So basically, within 2 months later, this guy was dead. So before Rosh Hashanah even. Sorry, the 7th. Sorry, that's incorrect. The 5th month was Av. So in the 7th month, sometime after Rosh Hashanah. And then we have that Yirmiyahu realized there's all these false prophets here. He wrote a letter, a sefer, basically a letter to the Jewish people and their elders and their Kohanim and false prophets, okay, or the people who want to claim to be prophets. Maybe there's some of them could be true. And he says that you have to watch out. You have false prophets in your midst, and you also have to make sure that because you're going to be staying in Bavel for a long time, the false prophets are telling you you're going to be leaving Bavel soon. He tells them, no, you're going to be there for a good 70 years. Seek the peace of the place and raise families, because you're not coming back for a while, so get used to it there. And here he says the 70 years prophecy over here. And also that God was telling that there's false prophets. Here we have a story that's elaborated upon in the Midrash, in, let's say, the last chapter of Sanhedrin. These 2 false prophets, Achav ben Kolaya, El Tzidkiyahu v'Masiyah, Hanibam lechem Shmi Shaker. They're also false prophets. They're speaking God's name falsely. They're going to fall in the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, really, in the old Babylonian language, the Resh and the Nun, just like the Resh and Lamed today, can be interchangeable. And this is, by the way, one of those other indications that Resh was pronounced the way we still pronounce it today, and not, let's say, modern Hebrew Resh or any of those European races that make people sound sinister. So he says that he's going to, the king himself is going to take care of them. They're going to be examples of corrupt people, that Tzidkiyahu and Achav, who were toasted by the king of Babylon in the fire. Why? Because they were basically adulterers. This is a type of false prophet. I guess just the personal ones. They're out there for personal benefit, political power, money, and women. They basically use their position as false holy men and seers to get what they want from women, sometimes married women, whatever it is, whoever is convenient. And it's sad that you have examples of this among, let's say, corrupt non-rabbi types who do this with certain regularity. I mean, it's not that they're doing it, they themselves do it with regularity, but also the news every few years has an example of someone with a nice beard, usually a nice yarmulke or hat, all the trappings of rabbinics, who's basically been taken advantage of women in extremely inappropriate ways, sins that we feel too ashamed to speak about in good company and on these YouTube videos. So that's what you have to look out for. And then you have the last one, Shmayahu Hanechelami, who is apparently telling people whatever it was. He's a false prophet. What is he saying to do? He'll never see the Tov that I'm going to do. He's basically one of those types who was not as bad as Achav ben Kolayah. And this Achav, sorry, it's Tzidkiyahu ben where's it go? We'll read the names again. Achav ben Kolayah and Tzidkiyahu ben Maasiyah. Tzidkiyahu ben Knana is mentioned earlier. We saw in the book of Kings there. This Shmayahu Nechelami, by the way, they argue, is he just from a place that has a name similar to Halom, or is it because he's dreaming all these things? This Shmaya ben Nechelami was one of those everything's going to be good prophets, don't worry about it, a yes man telling people what they wanted to hear. So why is he any different than the ones we've seen already? He could go into the previous categories. No, it's because he sought to persecute Yirmiyahu, get people against him. He's writing basically pamphlets. Shalachta v'shimcha Sfarim el kol am asher b'shleim v'letzfanyav v'nesiyah kohen v'alkonim le'mor. What? Go against this Yirmiyahu character. And this is the type of, I guess, false prophet type, whom I have personal experience. These types try to get others to do their dirty work. They're false prophesizing. They're telling people what they want to hear, maintain the status quo, everything will be just fine. And when they encounter a real prophet, they feel like they have to bring him down. Perhaps this is similar to the false prophet who felt he had to bring down the anonymous prophet who we saw last week originally rebuked King Yerovam. These kind, I don't know if they're the worst, but they're certainly the sneakiest. And there was no reason the Shmayahu Nechelami is not considered someone who's out there for personal gain. He's not there because he's in cahoots with the Jewish powers that be. He's not there preaching in the name of false God. What is he trying to do? He's just trying to make it harder for the true Navi. And that's a problem. And he's basically told, because he's the type of guy who just says everything's going to be fine to everybody, he's misleading everybody, his punishment will be that he will not actually get to see all the good that will actually come true when the time comes. Like I said, now would be a good time to review the last few chapters of Yesodei Torah. God willing, like I said, I think the Rav will get to that soon, so we don't need to get into this further. It's a little bit too late now to take any questions, so we'll deal with the questions next time, and we look forward to seeing you then. Be well.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.